Yeah, so you describe yourself as a xenologist. Can you tell me, like, what does that mean, and what is xenology? Where does it come from?
Yeah, so xenology is the study, analysis, and the development of the strange, alien, or other. And so a xenologist is one who, engages in xenology. And so this is a term that was originally came from science fiction. So back in the 1950s or 1960s, sort of different types of science fiction authors were trying to figure out what would you call the people who would be trying to study extraterrestrials, and what would you call them within the context of a science fiction novel. And then in the 1980s, this guy by the name of Robert Freitas was saying, well, we actually have existing xenologists on Earth, because they're engaged in things like the search for extraterrestrial intelligence and stuff like this. So these are people who are trying to search for different types of technosignatures or biosignatures. And so for me, I was sort of looking at these histories because sort of science fiction, speculative fiction, SETI are really big influences for my practice. But then I was also thinking about other types of bodies that are seen as strange, alien, or other. And that can cover a wide gamut of things from my perspective in terms of particular aspects of my identity. It's about being queer and trans and so forth. And thinking about the transformations of the body that can happen, and the ways in which we can become something other than what we were born with. And in a way, as I started thinking about this, I started from the perspective of, okay, this is particular types of bodies who experience this. And then I realized that no, all bodies engage in radical forms of transformation and transition over the course of their life. We only have to look at a child to someone who's in old age, right? And so thinking about the transformations that happen, and then thinking about how we can push this. Maybe, as myself as a transgender woman, I take hormones that transforms my body quite radically. And then I was thinking about what are the ways in which we may want to push this even further, given that what I see as in the universe, there's this cosmic given capabilities for change and transformation.
Cool, really concise and interesting explanation. So I wanted to ask you a little bit as well, because I have this lovely book by Hannah Pezzack, which is called the Xenofeminist Manifesto. And I see a lot of influence of her writing and her thoughts in your work. Particularly, I suppose, the way that you write almost like a manifesto, but you've also written love letters. Could you tell me a little bit more about how this book has inspired you, but also like how do these provocative forms of writing like manifestos help to, work as a call to action maybe, or how do they operate in your work?
Yeah, so I was definitely influenced by Hester's Xenofeminism book and also the Xenofeminist Manifesto that came before that. And for me, I was particularly interested in their approach to technology and the importance of technology in their practices. The Xenofeminist Manifesto, at least in my reading of it, they say it's a politics of alienation. And I was beginning to approach it from a different perspective, which is sort of the opposite, which is a politics of disalienation. And I see this practice as disalienation from sort of the limitations that are imposed upon us by capitalism in terms of our abilities to transform, transition, change, and so forth. And so for me, it's actually a practice of disalienation from those limitations, in a sense. And also thinking about how maybe our sorts of transformations don't necessarily need to be so Promethean, which is sort of one of the ways in which at least in my reading of the Xenofeminist Manifesto, they approach things. And so that comes to, in a way, the types of writing that I do. So I'm very influenced by manifestos, but I wanted to try and approach something a little bit more humble, which is a letter. And letters don't necessarily have to be humble, but, they do sort of present a much more personal approach to things versus a manifesto, which is sort of written from either a very much a collective focus or sort of like a royal we sort of focus, right? And I was trying to approach it from an I, and sort of an I that is also very much situated and embodied within particular times and moments. And that came from a lot of the work that I was doing in some of my previous research in the early days of xenology, or my practice in xenology, where I was thinking about how might we communicate with an entity say, some sort of extraterrestrial that might be around a star that's 40 light years away, right? As far as we know, any sort of transmission would take 40 years to get there and at least 40 years to get back. So we're talking about an 80-year round trip time. And so then I started thinking, okay, what form exists in terms of writing these days that sort of has that kind of temporal distance, and that's the letter, right? Letters, at least when we used to write them on paper and send them into the mail, right? Physical mail, they would take a long time to get somewhere, right? They may not reach the destination on time. There's not sort of like an ability to know when your recipient is going to read the letter, right? So it makes you think about time and temporality in a different way. And then I also realized, and this happened, you know, from some of my own experiences growing up, right? I had a lot of pen pals, sort of because of the rural location that I grew up in. You know, letters were a way to represent different types of ideas and desires and so forth that I might not have been able to represent in spoken word or in other forms or things like that. And so the letter became a way for me to encapsulate these desires, let's say. And so I think of this as a way to, express these types of desires and things like that, that we have sometimes difficulties with in other situations. And there's been a lot of sort of recent work amongst queer and trans authors around the epistolary as a form.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Like when you're talking, there's so much within your work, but these themes of temporality, desire, longing, it's all there, I guess, in your practice.
Yep.
So I did want to ask specifically about a particular artwork, which is xenological entanglements, which takes shape as a performance and objects. So it's the piece, if I'm correct, speculates on handheld microgravity equipment that would allow people to genetically self-engineer their hormones. Could you explain this a little bit further? And maybe as a sub-question, is the work maybe inspired by the idea that trans people might be free from some of the very oppressive and pathologizing medical and healthcare frameworks they've had to come up with? Yeah,
for sure. So this is a project where indeed I started it thinking as a trans person who wants to go to space at some point and thinking about what I would need for a long duration space journey, and I would need my hormones. And so I was thinking, well, if I would go on these long duration space journeys, I could potentially bring the hormones as pharmaceuticals, but maybe they would run out, maybe they would go bad, and so I ideally would have something that would allow me to produce my own hormones. And so then I was thinking about sort of the process of hormone generation in the body. And so the biochemical way this happens is everything begins with cholesterol, actually, and a bunch of enzymes transform that molecule into testosterone. And then a certain enzyme called aromatase transforms testosterone into estrogen, or forms of estrogen, let's say. And so I realized, well, what if I could just genetically engineer my testicular cells to convert that testosterone into estrogen by making those cells produce this enzyme, aromatase. And so that then led to sort of the subtitle of the project, aromatase. And so then I was realizing that, maybe there's a way to just turn on that gene. And so that is a form of genetic engineering that would not require sort of inserting new genes into the body, but just sort of thinking about turning something on. And for me, that also connects with this idea of xenology insofar as basically it says that we possess all these capabilities already in our bodies, right? And it's more about what gets turned on, what gets expressed, and so forth. And so we sort of came up with a whole plan of doing this. And then it was COVID and lockdowns and curfews and everything in the place where I was working for this residency. And so we were unable to actually do the work. But I would be remiss without saying that this sort of a project is also influenced by other artists working in this domain, like Mary Magic, who has this project called Housewives Making Drugs, which is also about creating the conditions for trans and gender nonconforming people to have access to making their own hormones. And so yes, while it remains a perfectly plausible scientific project right now, it does not actually exist. I'm happy if anyone has any sort of funding to support this. But yes, the idea would be that I originally designed it for an outer space context, but that outer space context, like everything about outer space, has to do with things here on Earth, right? And so this was really about, yes, potentially having this capability to not be beholden to, pharmaceutical companies, juridical regimes, and so forth that are making it very difficult for people to have access to their hormones around the world these days.
Yeah. I mean, so two caveats. Mary Magic's work is incredible. We worked with them before at Sonic Acts, and this is a public shout out, so please get Adriana some funding to realise this project.
Yeah.
But I suppose, like something I really have been wanting to ask you is like, I suppose for a lot of people nowadays looking at space exploration, we've come from it within the context of people like Elon Musk calling for the uber rich to colonize Mars and escape planet Earth. And of course, like the space race itself took place in this awful context of the Cold War, and it had a lot of nationalistic intentions. So how do you see yourself like in relation or like contextualized by these more, maybe colonialist, expansionist kind of intentions when it comes to the cosmos?
Yeah, so for sure. I mean, we are embedded. I mean, the space activities, especially from the U.S. context, which is where I was born, it's very much military focused. And even today, most of the astronauts that are selected have military backgrounds of some sort. However, that's not our only imaginary space, right? And so I'm very much influenced by, say, the Russian cosmists. I'm influenced by different types of queer and feminist science fiction that suggests that outer space and our experience of outer space can be done differently, right? And I think this is also part of my practice as someone who has training within the sciences as well as the arts and humanities, is space, engineering, science is too important to be left only to the engineers and the scientists. And so a lot of what I'm interested in is how can we articulate and potentially also create projects that engage with this world differently. And so as a result, we have to sometimes work with these organizations while at the same time being a little bit, and oftentimes very critical of them as well. And I mean, SpaceX is an interesting corporation because of that. So run by Elon Musk, but also there's other people who are very much involved as sort of in the corporate structure of SpaceX right now. And what's interesting is because it's a commercial entity, it doesn't necessarily follow the same strictures as governmental space agencies. So for example, a few years ago, SpaceX had this or launched this rocket with a program called Inspiration 4 on it. And it was 4 people. It was a commercially funded project. And these 4 people went up in orbit around the Earth for, something like 3 or 4 days. Fully commercially funded by a billionaire and so forth. However, one of the people who was on that flight was a woman who had childhood cancer and actually had a rod in her leg. This woman would have never gotten to go to space with any of the governmental space agencies. And so this is a situation where the commercial sector is, even though it pains me to say it, is actually allowing these types of things to happen if you have the money. That's of course the problem with the commercial sector, and that's why I would much rather have these things being publicly run. However, this is the situation we find ourselves in, where sometimes commercial activities in space allow us to do things that we would never be able to do if we had to rely on the governmental space agencies.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so launching off, which is a terrible pun, forgive me, from that, could you tell me a little bit about your artwork TX1, which is a piece where you launched your hormone replacement medications into space? And okay, so how did that come about and why did you do it?
Yeah, so TX1 was part of a bigger project called Sojourner 2020 that was sort of run by the MIT Space Exploration Initiative, and they actually had an open call. And so I was one of 9 artists that were able to do this. And what was interesting also about that open call is that we had artists, one was an indigenous person from North America, another artist from Peru, an artist from Thailand. I mean, it was very much a worldwide group of artists. And again, that's rare in space activities. And in part, it was because this was being launched as part of a commercial payload. And if people don't know this, there's a lot of sort of very big commercial entities that allow you to send things to space for the right amount of money. And so this one was an organization called NanoRacks. And so we were able to launch as part of some secondary aspects of this particular payload that they were sending up there. And so this was, there's been a small handful of projects that have actually been able to go to space and orbit the Earth and be on the space station, whether it was Mir or the International Space Station. And so this project, yes, was able to launch fragments of my hormone replacement medications. And the idea here was to send some aspect of my experience up there. And this was a sort of project that came together very quickly. So it was basically 9 months from the opening of the open call to launch, which was
total gestation.
Yeah, basically, exactly. And so, we also had a lot of constraints on size and mass and so forth, because it's expensive to send things to space. So the project was actually launched, the things that I launched were very, very small. So these spheres about 5 millimeters in diameter. And so this marked the first known time of elements of the trans experience orbiting the Earth, and first known trans artist, I guess, to put something in space. And so they went to the space station, orbited for a month, and then importantly came back. So they didn't just sort of burn up in the atmosphere, as lots of things do that go to space, but actually came back. I can hold it, I can exhibit it, and so forth. And for me, this is very important because it indicates something about some ideas of resilience and so forth, of not just being disposed of or burning up in the atmosphere, but some sort of ability to come and thrive once again. So it's not about exodus from the Earth necessarily. It's about maybe going up there and experiencing something different up there, possibly, and then coming back and living here on Earth again.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So I was really intrigued to learn from you, actually. Mm-hmm. So talking about Elon Musk and this desire to colonize Mars, humans would really struggle to live on Mars. Mm-hmm. But in fact, some species of lichen, mm-hmm. which is this funny kind of green substance that grows on rocks and places that are damp and stuff, that could feasibly survive on Mars. Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting when you go into the history of lichen, because it's a little bit of an alien creature in the history of science. Mm-hmm. For a very long time, people didn't understand it because it's not actually one thing. It's both an algae and a fungus, and these two entities sort of live symbiotically within one thing. And within Western science, we've not really liked that very much. It's been very problematic. We want things to be one thing, to not be invaded, to have very strict borders and selfhoods. So people just never really understood for a very long time what lichen was all about, what it was really going on. I'm drawing a complicated point, I feel, but I'm really fascinated in your work about this affinity or identification with what has been seen as strange or alien. And could you maybe, particularly in relation to what has not been seen as normal or natural, which of course is complicated when you have things like lichen, which are part of the natural world. Yeah. Could you maybe expand a little bit on this? I know that was a very interesting and long question.
No, definitely. No, I mean, it very much hits on a point that's, very important in thinking about my work, because so lichen are sort of seen, so I pronounce it as lichen, from, I guess that's
British
US English pronunciation. So what's interesting about lichen, right, is this symbiotic nature. Although, maybe it's not exactly so symbiotic. There's a lot of sort of debates within the scientific literature about how equal the partnership is and so forth. And also those debates might be influenced by sort of competitive notions of evolution. That's a sort of a bigger conversation to have. But basically, it's this integration, fundamental integration of sort of a fungus and an algae. And what's really interesting is that if you separate the fungus and just try and grow it by itself, it looks white and fuzzy. And we do this in some of the classes that I do with students in my master's program. And then you try and separate the algae and it's green. You put them together and you get this crusty thing or something that's very leafy, and it could be yellow or orange or green or brown, right? And so it's very fascinating that this combination creates something that is very much different than the parts, right? But we could say that that's life itself, right? And that's one of the interesting things about a lot of the research that's been going on, say, around the microbiome, the gut microbiome, the skin microbiome in humans, right? And so we sort of ask ourselves, well, we're not humans without these other organisms living with us, so why do we sort of create these separations between, ourselves and other organisms, right? And it really goes down to this notion of species, right? Why do we sort of name one particular thing as one species? And it actually becomes a real issue when you're talking about lichen. Like we have these names, say, Xanthoria elegans, Xanthoria parietina, which is a species name referencing the fungus, but it's really multiple organisms. And lichen researchers have found it's not only just the two organisms, but there's maybe other fungi involved. So it could be like 5 or 6 different types of fungi. There's bacteria that are living within sort of the lichen, crustose or foliose and so forth. And so it's really an ecosystem. And so when we think about this, then maybe we realize that there's not much separation between ourselves and the environment and these boundaries that we've tried to create within recent aspects of Western thought, Western technoscience, and so forth. These boundaries are perhaps a lot more porous than we originally thought. And, one of the things that I've been researching in some of my recent work as well is a lot of this separation comes from, particular strands of Western technoscience, but that's not always been the thought within other aspects of, say, Western practices as well, things that are coming from witchcraft or pagan thought or things like this, right? That sort of realized that, no, we're not really separate from these environments. We have this very mutating, porous relationship, with other entities, and to make these separations really is perhaps not what we should be doing.
Yeah, gosh, I'm so glad you're so well versed in your lichen knowledge in terms and Latin names. You explained that so well. Nature itself is so sci-fi in so many ways,
exactly.
right? And I think part of, we need to acknowledge that. Something I've been desperate to ask you, actually, and I noticed there's a lot of references in your work to kind of Afrofuturist, a lot of sci-fi writers, and something that I think about a lot when I'm looking at your work and hearing you speak about your work is this quote from Octavia Butler's Earthseed series, To Take Root Amongst the Stars.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about the influence of sci-fi and maybe Afrofuturism in your practice?
So it actually took me a long time to read Octavia Butler for some reason. And my entry into this actually was Sun Ra, and Space is the Place, yes. Which the film has, it's complicated. We could have a complex discussion about some of the issues with the film, but a lot of the ideas in it are quite fascinating, right? And I have a background also as a musician, so I'm very much connected to that idea of sort of the integration of music, art, science fiction, and so forth. And so, when I was, reading and learning about Sun Ra's approach to things and sort of seeing how that kind of Black American, African American sort of approach to things was about, okay, yeah, maybe space is a better place. Maybe we're from Saturn, right? At least that's, the way that Sun Ra was talking about it for the Black African Americans, right? And so, I was thinking, okay, that's really fascinating. That's sort of, I'm approaching it from a different perspective, right? Which is sort of a white, trans, queer woman from sort of rural part of the US. But hey, there's something interesting that resonates there in terms of this desire for outer space as another environment that perhaps is more hospitable to us than here on Earth. And so once I finally started reading Octavia Butler, and I read the Xenogenesis trilogy first, I think that was what really, it was sort of also at the same time that I was beginning to transition and taking hormones. And a lot of the Xenogenesis trilogy is very much about transformations of the body. And very complicated transformations of the body. Because, a lot of what we've been talking about today has been things that are like, oh, it's great, transformation, porousness, symbiosis, and so forth. It's also really painful. It's also really hard. It's something that we're not very good at right now. And the Xenogenesis trilogy gets at a lot of those difficulties. Because I think it's not good to necessarily always valorize transformation and change and so forth without recognizing that, yeah, it has challenges. It means certain things have to change, literally, in terms of how we relate to the world. And so, when I started reading her Parable series as well, that was like, oh, wow, you have said what you wrote 30 years ago, what I've been sort of thinking about and developing now. And so, certainly the Earthseed approach is something that is very influential for me. And the thing that I really love about the Parable series is that, even though it's very scary, the Parable series, because it's written basically 2024, this year, and it has uncomfortable references and resonances with what's going on right now in actually existing United States in 2024. Even though these people are dealing with the literal apocalypse happening, they still have this desire to go to space, right? And so for me, in my reading of it, this desire is not about escape or exodus necessarily. It's about what do we need to change in terms of our practices here on Earth so that we don't replicate the same things out there. And so for me, that sort of twinning of both the desire to go to outer space, but also the transformation of what needs to happen here is what really motivates me so much in terms of my love for the Parables series. And then the other thing that I'm really interested in with that is the fact that Earthseed is a religion, right? It brings in the spiritual. And we can have a lot of complicated conversations about sort of the way in which Lauren Oya Olamina, and the character in the book, sort of becomes, whether she wants to or not, sort of the messiah figure in a certain sense of that religion, and sort of the way in which her behavior changes as a result of that. I think it's remiss, we would be remiss to talk about outer space without also talking about the spiritual. And so for me, that's also what's so important about the Parables series, is it really foregrounds that. And I think if we focus on space too much from a technoscientific perspective only, then we lose what is also a very important part of our life, which is this other part that we can't always explain right now. I'm a materialist. I think we can explain it eventually. But we can't right now. So we have to call it the spiritual, the other, the strange, the xeno.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's another beautiful part of your work, right? That when we think about the cosmos, it does have this history of the sacred. Mm-hmm. And I mean, okay, forgive me for quoting a dead old white philosopher, but I was rereading some Maurice Blanchot, mm-hmm. And he talks about the etymology of disaster, mm-hmm. and that it comes from literally like separation from humankind from the stars, mm-hmm. like disaster. And I was thinking about living in a time of crisis and how we have been so separated from things like the night sky. Mm-hmm. And within your work, for instance, you've tracked the route of Venus through the sky, and I was wondering, could you expand a little bit on that? And,
mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely. So, a lot of the work that I was doing a couple of years ago was about actually going to space, and then as we talked about with the lichen and so forth, I was realizing, oh wow, maybe it's really hard for humans to go to space right now in terms of the transformations that we would need to do to our bodies and so forth, which we just can't do. And so then that led me to think about the other types of relationship we could potentially have with the sky, which is looking at it, tracking it, and understanding it. And so one of the things I've been doing is just doing some research about, ancient practices of tracking the sky and looking at these things, and sort of also realizing and understanding that we've been doing this for like 10,000 years or longer, and sort of the importance of the night sky to sort of different groups of people all throughout the world in human history, and the care that went into calculating and tracking and understanding as a way of divination, let's say, as a way of trying to tell stories about the sky, about their deities or so forth. That was one of the things about Venus. So Venus, because of its orbit around the sun and our relationship to that orbit, has this interesting quality where it will appear in the morning sky just before dawn, or in the evening sky just after dusk, and then sometimes it will disappear. As a result, the deities and stories that are told about Venus end up being very sort of about transformation, about travel to an underworld, and things like this. And so what I've been realizing is that, we exist, if we're living in cities, right, we exist under conditions of heavy light pollution and so forth, and maybe we need to tell different stories based off of what we can see. Venus, however, is bright enough that we can almost always see it no matter what the light pollution is. And so this got me thinking, well, maybe we need to have new sorts of mythologies or stories around Venus that are related to what we do right now. Maybe we need to develop these new constellations. Constellations, of course, are not fixed. There's as many, constellations and stories about constellations around the world as there are groups of humans, right? And so there's no reason that we need to necessarily keep the same ones now. And in fact, within sort of the history of the quote-unquote Western constellations, a bunch of new ones were created in the 18th and 19th centuries after, the colonizers went to the southern hemisphere and realized that there were stars that they didn't know. And so then they started naming them after scientific objects of the time, like the air pump or the sextant or things like this. So we can change those constellations. We can tell different stories. And for me, that's what's most important about it.
I had no idea that they were named after these industrial age objects. That's insane. Okay, I actually, something that we haven't touched upon yet is that you have modular synthesizers and you make equipment for them. Could you tell me a little bit more about how you do that and what role do your synthesizers have in your artistic practice?
Yeah, so I started working with modular synthesizers a few years ago, and sort of, there's a long history of women and trans women being involved in this, and so I joke that I'm sort of a walking stereotype because there's lots of trans women involved in modular synthesizers. And so one of the things that I started doing with this is I wanted to create a module that would represent my understanding of time. Because I wanted to represent all of these sort of overlapping temporalities that I feel from the quantum to the cosmic, like the vibration of an atom alongside the rotation of the sun around the galactic center of the Milky Way, to me replacing my estrogen patches every week. And I wanted a way to sort of represent that within my modular system. And so I started making my own modules to do that. So that's sort of where this began, as sort of like a very practical way to be able to do this within the system. And because I have this background as a violinist, as a violist, and sort of from a classical tradition, I actually don't like making music with a laptop. So I really wanted something that would be put in a system that could be self-contained, that wouldn't require a laptop, and that I could just sort of interact with as an instrument, let's say, just like itself. Not that a computer isn't an instrument, but it's just not the type of instrument that I want to use for my own work. So that's where sort of this started. And then, I've been sort of working on other things having to do with radio and so forth. So different types of modules that are engaged with other aspects of my sonic practice. And so, this has become a big part of this. And also thinking about very practically, I'm the child of multiple accountants, two accountants, sort of like, how do we make ourselves sustainable as artists within sort of a capitalist society? I, along with lots of other artists living in Europe, are lucky to have sort of grants and things like this. Very competitive sometimes, but to have access to these things. But I think we also sometimes need to think about other ways of funding our work. And so that's why the modular synthesizer stuff is like a commercial enterprise as a way to feed in and hopefully support some of my other work. And there's a whole story told through letters about sort of in sort of the cosmos of my modular synthesis business that really sort of touches upon some of these things we were just talking about Venus, about sort of like archaeology, about sort of our relationship into transitioning, transition, transformation, and the xeno.
Oh, I've read some of these actually. Yeah, it really got me thinking about love letters in your work as well, and yeah, the epistemology format. So maybe we could just end on a kind of hopeful question, or a nice question, which is, you unearthed a really fascinating publication that I'd not heard of before, and I don't know if many people will, which is called Moonshadow, and it's published by a group of transgender activists in the 1970s in California. There are these beautiful illustrations of these kind of astronauts and like ethereal women in space, kind of. Can you tell me a bit more about this publication and how it came to be and what its aims were?
Yeah, so I should say that I learned about this from the work of A.J. Lewis, who's a trans scholar who wrote about, this Moonshadow newsletter, which was basically, the sort of a way of transsexual women, as they were calling themselves in the 1970s, to share information. And during that time period where they were not able to be out in public, where they had basically the only ability to communicate was through the mail, through zines, through letters, say, within this zine, and so forth. And Moonshadow newsletter was done by this woman, or started by this woman, Angela Douglas. And she had this sort of a very interesting particular way of approaching the world that was also looking at the resonances potentially between extraterrestrials and transsexual women, and sort of looking at the discrimination that extraterrestrials experiences as similar to the discrimination that transsexual women were experiencing, and sort of thinking about what sorts of solidarities could potentially happen between the two. And, this is 1970s, lots of sort of interesting new feminist movements, queer and trans movements that are developing questions of solidarity across different types of identity formations and so forth. And so, I think Douglas was trying to approach things from that perspective as well. And so one of the other people who was very much involved in sort of the visual identity of this was a transsexual woman by the name of Susan David. And so she drew these very pop art inspired images of transsexual women as extraterrestrials, as cyborgs, et cetera, et cetera. And so, this, the title itself was very evocative to me. And so, it has definitely influenced some of my work, influenced the title of a work. And what we know a fair bit about Angela Douglas. There's, some archives about it. Susan David, unfortunately, we don't know much about at all. And I think, this is one of the things, I know you said sort of end on a hopeful note. I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting about this is sort of like maybe both how much we've progressed. Well, I don't want to say progressed, how much things have changed since that time, right? We don't necessarily know whether Susan David is still alive, when she died, or anything like this. However, I'm here able to have a conversation with you today about these things, which may not have been possible 20 or 30 years ago. And so I think we have to remember both how much we've been able to progress since that time, but also how much of these rights and the rights of so many people around the world are currently under attack again. And somehow we have to create these solidarities anew every, seemingly every decade or two in order to both keep the rights that we've already developed, but also try and develop them further.
Yeah, it's a really important and prescient reminder. Yeah.